The 15 years that follow Ronald Reagan's presidency are really sort of a mix of things, primarily because there are a lot of questions about uh, what we do and who we are, not just in the larger global sense of the word, but even domestically and within ourselves. And a lot of that is stirred on primarily because of the sudden end of communism, the collapse of communism in Russia and in other Eastern European countries really brings on an identity crisis of sorts, which is ironic because you would think that it's only happening for Russia and these Eastern European countries because it's the end of their governments and their existing ideologies. But interestingly enough, what ends up happening is it forces the United States to really re examine who it is that we are ideologically and what it is that we do. Because keep in mind, for the previous 40 some odd years since the end of World War II, the United States was the face of the Cold War from the side of democracy and capitalism, and then suddenly we weren't. And so now you have this question of, okay, what is it that we're supposed to fight now? And what is it that we're supposed to fight for? What is our great enemy going to be? Or do we have to have a great enemy? These are the questions that we are asking ourselves in 1989. And so that's what leads to this theme for this particular chapter, and that is, who are we now? And what does it mean to be the United States in this particular time period? So we start off by looking at the presidency of George H.W. Bush. And what is interesting about George H.W. Bush, and in a lot of ways really unfortunate, is that, George H.W. Bush is overlooked and underestimated a lot, primarily because he only served the one term as president. But he comes into office in 1989 as the man with the most experience. He had served as ambassador to China. He had served as ambassador to the United Nations. He had served during World War II. He had also served as a congressman from Texas. He had also served as leader of the Republican Party. At one point, he had also served his 8 years as vice president under Ronald Reagan. So this was a man who understood the value, the importance of the United States on an international scale, but also domestically. He was also someone who understood what was happening in this very pivotal and important time as the world was going through this transition of Cold War into a post-Cold War world. And so it was vital, really, in a lot of ways, to have someone like him at the helm because of that level of experience. That said, it was interesting to have um, Bush and his understanding of things. At the leadership level because of the people he would have in his administration. If you look at the image of at the image here at the bottom of the screen, and I'll use my little pen here to point them out. This person right here and this person right here are people you are going to see again towards the end of this lecture, primarily because they will serve in George H.W. Bush's son's administration in 2000. This right here is Dick Cheney, and this is General Colin Powell. Both of these men were in service for um, the senior Bush and Junior, and both of them had very important roles with both administrations. But in the second Bush administration, they played even more influential roles, and so we'll get into that later. With the senior Bush, though, I think the difference that you'll see is that the senior Bush is much more decisive, I think is the right word. And the reason why he's more decisive is because of his experience and because he understood things better and he understood international politics in particular much better. And I think you see that most in the first Gulf War. So when we talk about the first Gulf War, that takes place in 1991, the reason why the first Gulf War is worth mentioning is because it is the first post Cold War issue, the international crisis that takes place. And it's really sort of one of these situations that comes up that challenges um, the United States in a way that it brings up this question of, okay, what is it that we are standing for in this time period, right? So, what takes place, just to give you a little bit of background, is that the country of Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, who was a former ally, I should add, had launched an invasion into Kuwait, the smaller country of Kuwait, and had taken control. And so George H.W. Bush had given the orders to send in troops to not only to drive out Iraqi forces and make sure that Kuwait had been taken control of and restored back to Kuwaiti control. And the fight itself, Operation Desert Storm, does not take very long. It takes overall a couple of months over the course of 1991. Saddam Hussein remained in power. George H.W. Bush was presented with the option of removing him from power. But I want to make sure that you understand this because Eric Foner does not talk about this. But George H.W. Bush Sr. was presented with the option of removing Saddam Hussein from power because Saddam Hussein was a tyrant, a dictator. This was not a secret to anyone. He was someone who was famous for executing his opponents, for torturing people. So this was not a good man at all. And so this was not someone that you wanted necessarily in power. However, George H.W. Bush said, listen, unless there is someone that could replace him, a viable replacement for this man, then no, you have to keep him in power. He's not ideal, but ironically, Hussein is someone that represents stability in a very unstable situation. Ironically, Hussein was someone who actually kept out the most extreme people from power. Interestingly enough, when we talk about Saddam Hussein, who was, again, a very terrible, terrible person, what he successfully did was he kept threats to his power out. He kept Muslim extremists and other threats to his power, other dictators, other possible worst dictators away. And so George H.W. Bush said, listen, unless you have a better option, I don't want to hear about it. And the thing of it is, George H.W. Bush is no fool. He said, if you remove Saddam Hussein from power, this could absolutely turn into another Vietnam. This could absolutely turn into another Vietnam War, and that is not an option here. And so he wisely says, keep Saddam Hussein in power, leave him there. All the intention of this war was to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait and leave it at that. And he successfully does so, and American forces successfully does so. Unfortunately for George H.W. Bush, uh, things domestically don't go as well for him as expected, because he had made promises that he had to back off of, such as no new taxes. You never make a promise like that. He did. And there were new taxes. And that's where the Democrats got him. And in 1992, you have the election of a brand new Democrat. Bill Clinton had been the governor of Arkansas, and a relatively new name to national politics. I mean, Bill Clinton was not someone who people had given a lot of attention to, or quite frankly, not a whole lot of chance to. But yet, he was someone who managed to um, gain some popularity and really, quite frankly, come from behind. He was someone who was able to gain support from both the left as well as from middle of the road Democrats, and a lot of the African American community. He was someone who was able to gain a lot of moderate support. And quite frankly, there were a lot of people um, who were just eager for this idea of change. And so, what you see there on the right is the letter that George H.W. Bush left for him on his first day of office in the White House, which is a quite gracious letter. And the and Clinton's time in office is a really interesting one, because Clinton's time in office is a time of where you have a lot of Democrats hoping that he is going to be this um, reclamation for leftist policies, a reclamation for real left wing, more progressive ideas. And that's not what he does. He is not that kind of guy. He is not that kind of Democrat. His wife would be, but the problem with that is that Hillary Clinton almost immediately becomes a target. Being a woman, Hillary Clinton being educated, Hillary Clinton being significantly smarter than her husband, is really problematic. And so, because of that, she's immediately a target for Republicans and for anyone on the conservative side of politics. And so, as a result, you have uh, a lot of people who see Bill Clinton sort of steering himself towards the middle of the road and even towards the conservative side of things. Now, that said, Bill Clinton really does change things up a little bit. He appoints more African Americans and more women to posts in his cabinet. The first woman attorney general, of course, is Janet Reno. He's got more liberals on the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for example, is appointed to the Supreme Court during his time period. The policy of "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" is the new military policy for gay people, which is a terrible policy, but it's better than the policy that they had, which is gay people are not allowed. But "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" doesn't work at all. So there's that. So Clinton is a bit of a challenge. because when we talk about his approach to politics, it's a bit hit or miss, right? If you're a Democrat, because you want him to be progressive, you want him to be left wing, and he's not really quite that. The real problem, though, is for Republicans who really just are targeting him and really want him to be out of office, but can't really figure out how to get him until 1994. 1994 is the time of the congressional midterm elections, and they call it the Freedom Revolution, and by they I mean the Republicans, because they have this huge victory in which they regain control of Congress, and that's under the leadership of a man named Newt Gingrich, who is pictured there on the right. Newt Gingrich is someone who had worked his way up through Congress over the course of a few decades. And Newt Gingrich is really interesting because he had been working for a while as someone who had tried to get his way into Congress and just couldn't really figure out how, until he decided to really take advantage of this whole idea of a Republican who, like Ronald Reagan, was merging this idea of Christianity and republicanism. So hopefully you remember this from the previous lecture, but he was sort of marrying these two ideas, right? So Newt Gingrich is one of those conservative intellectuals, right? You remember the term neoconservatives? That's Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich is a neoconservative. He's got his PhD in American history, so he's very intelligent. He understands strategy, he understands politics, and he understands the long game, right? He understands why it's important to not just focus on the immediate losses, but also understand how those shape him for the long term. And so Gingrich had been in Congress for a long time and had been working on building up the Republican Party for what would be not just what would work for the 1990s, but going into the 2000s, the 2010s, and into present day. So everything that we are looking at with the Republican Party present day, a lot of its roots go back to things that Newt Gingrich did in the 1990s and even into the 1980s. Okay, so on page 1081, Eric Foner talks quite a bit about Gingrich's idea called the contract with America, which is basically his idea of cutting back the size of the government and basically cutting back all of these federal programs and, cutting back all of these things that he says robs the American individual of all of their freedoms. But what he's really talking about is about cutting back on all of these programs that would help poor people, right? And also cutting back on regulations like economic regulations, environmental regulations, and things like that. And Foner talks about that, like I said, on page 1081. So make sure you read up on that. What ends up happening is Gingrich and Clinton, who oddly enough look a lot like each other, just keep that in mind. Gingrich and Clinton really meet their match in each other. So while Clinton is in the White House, here's Gingrich in Congress. And Gingrich is the Speaker of the House. And so in 1994, while Gingrich is Speaker of the House, he is the most powerful Republican in the country. And Clinton, being the most powerful Democrat in the country, go head to head a lot. And so as a result, you will have times where the government shuts down because these two clash. You will have times where these two will really sort of disagree to the point where the country freezes a lot, and it becomes really problematic. And you'll see that again later on when it comes to the issue of Bill Clinton's impeachment. I do want to bring up Bill Clinton's foreign policy, though, particularly when it comes to things like the Oslo Accords. So on page 1082, the Oslo Accords are addressed by Foner, where he talks about um, what Clinton is doing to address the issue of Middle East peace policy. Now, one of the things that I want to address here is the fact that Bill Clinton doesn't have a whole lot of background here in terms of foreign policy, right? He's a guy who used to be a governor. Foreign policy is not his forte. He is someone who's focused primarily on domestic policy. So when he comes into this, he would rather deal with domestic policy, right? But he's a lot like Jimmy Carter, as Foner points out. He's a lot like Jimmy Carter in that he's interested in this idea of trying to settle these long-term international conflicts. And so the Oslo Accords um, seem to were an attempt, I should say, to try and settle these Middle Eastern conflicts. The problem, though, is that neither side were really willing to do the work that was required to actually bring peace to the situation, and it's really difficult to get that to really achieve peace if nobody's actually willing to do the entire job that's required. This was the frustration on Bill Clinton's part. Well, because he was so close to getting there, and yet it just didn't work out. The other issue that comes up is, of course, what takes place in the tragedy, of course, that takes place in Rwanda. So Rwanda is, of course, an issue of human rights. So in Rwanda, which is a country in Africa, in Central Africa, there was a clear issue of human rights. And what was taking place was that you have two tribes essentially at war. In fact, it's not at war, it's one tribe completely slaughtering another tribe. 800,000 people were brutally murdered. We are talking about men, women, and children just slaughtered. And then 2 million of them were trying to escape. 2 million of them had become refugees. And essentially, while these things were happening, and they were happening while the world was watching, let me just add that. And let me just say, as someone who was growing up during that time and watching it on television, I like seeing it on channels like CNN. It's on film. You can watch it on video, to see these people who were already living in poverty and now trying to escape with their lives, to watch this happening in real time, and then to watch as the United States, this supposed beacon of freedom, as Harry Truman said we were, and as Franklin Roosevelt said we were supposed to be. Remember that Franklin Roosevelt said that anytime you have this, you were supposed to stand up for freedom from want and freedom from oppression, all of that stuff. The United States never did a thing, not one thing, because there were no economic interests, there were no strategic interests, and it was a country in Central Africa. And the tragedy is something that people try to dismiss and forget. But those are images that I think many of us who watched in real time will have to live with for the rest of our lives. In the meantime, as Foner points out on page 1086, is probably and I agree, the most complicated issue of Clinton's presidency, and that's what happens in the Balkans. So here's what ends up happening in the Balkans, and that's the Balkan crisis. So with the Balkans, there were the country of Yugoslavia, which had existed during the time of the Cold War. It was a country that had been occupied by groups of multiple ethnicities, right? Um, and so it had been something that had been carved out. It's just something with a long, deep history that goes back to the end of World War One. And one of the problems that had come up, uh, going back to the collapse of communism, is the fact that each of these ethnic groups had established their own governments and therefore their own countries. The problem then was that each of these countries had conflict that had come up, um, between them. And one of the things that they decided to do, what to resolve these conflicts, was to essentially destroy each other, um, by ethnicity. And the brand new term that was created to describe or define what was going on was ethnic cleansing. Um, the forcible expulsion, as Foner writes, the forcible expulsion of a particular ethnic group. Um, so, as he writes, it's by the end of 1993, more than 100,000 Bosnians uh, had been killed by the end of the year. Um, this was yet another human rights crisis, and it had really brought forth this question about who it was we were in the world, in global politics. Like, what was it that we were supposed to do? I mean, what now that we were confronted with what was going on in Rwanda and then with what was happening in Bosnia, what was the role that the United States was going to play? Because with presidents like Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, who had both said that we were supposed to be examples of freedom and not just of democracy, clearly we were supposed to, according to them, step in for issues like this. But in the post Cold War world, does that still apply? That's the question. And nobody was really sure how to answer, especially in a world where you have a party that says we need to cut back on the size of government, we need to cut back on funding, that says we need to provide and protect, for our own people. How do you then justify on helping those in international crises? Um, I mean, that's the thing. If you go into um, that question, Foner talks about this more about in the section on human rights, on page 1086, the bottom half. I mean, this is the problem in and of itself, right? But that's the thing when we talk about this question of globalization and why it matters so much. Let's talk about, first of all, what that means. So, when we talk about globalization, if you're looking for the definition, it's right there on page 1087. So, make sure you go to the book, write it down, and learn it, and make sure you understand it. So, globalization is the process by which people, investment, goods, information, and culture increasingly flow across national boundaries. I'm going to say that again. It's the process by which people, investment, goods, information, and culture increasingly flow across national boundaries. And so when we talk about globalization and the very idea of globalization, one of the big problems with globalization, or the perceived threats of globalization, is this very idea that um, you as a country, you as a cultural identity, you as a nationality are possibly losing your overall identity to other peoples, other places. And that's a part of the problem, right? And so there are people who, as Foner explains, there are people who argue that large corporations are pushing to steal your national identity, that immigrants are pushing to steal your national identity, that both of those things are pushing to steal your national identity or your cultural identity and that sort of thing. When we talk about all of these issues, what's really at the heart and soul of these things is that um, there is this valid argument that there is a rising inequality. And by rising inequality, I mean an economic issue that's taking place here. When we talk about rising inequality, there are jobs that are lost. As a result of things like globalization. Here's the thing: globalization, in and of itself, is not new. When we talk about globalization, thanks to things like trade, thanks to things like migrants and migration, um, thanks to things like uh, the influence of language and culture and food and fabrics, all of that stuff. Globalization has existed since the beginning of mankind, right? We've always had globalization to a certain extent, so that's not a new thing. But when we talk about how large corporations will take their companies and perhaps take it to smaller countries for cheaper labor. And because unions aren't there, and because there aren't as many regulations there, and because you don't have to pay for safety issues over there, um, then that means you have a loss of jobs over here. So, say, for example, if you have a corporation in a large city over here, but you realize that in a developing country, you don't have to pay for things like health insurance, you don't have to pay for things like retirement or pension, or you don't have to pay for things like life insurance, you don't have to pay for things like making sure that there are safety regulations. All of those things add up in costs. And whatever you don't have to pay, you get to keep in profit. Meanwhile, you don't have to necessarily pay those workers nearly as much as you pay your educated workers here in the United States or anywhere else in the Western or developed nations. That all makes a difference. Meanwhile, those people who are living in the developed world, or underdeveloped worlds, developing nations, those people are uh, just as much victims as people living here in these cities, because those people are still living in abject poverty because they're not getting nearly enough money for the kind of job they're doing. And so that's the problem here. And when we talk about globalization, one of the problems here is that you kind of have to be aware of what's really taking place, right? That's the kind of situation that we're at. And that leads me to this idea. And I've got to add, rising inequality is something that Foner actually gets into even more on page 1091. So if you want to get into what he talks about, make sure that you do. So that's on page 1091. So that leads me into this whole idea of culture wars. Please make sure that you notice that I use culture wars in quotes. Uh, that's really kind of important here. So when I talk about culture wars, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind here is that culture wars is really sort of an idea that's projected onto American society a lot. It's not that people really truly believe that there is some sort of cultural war at stake. It's usually because it's a message that's projected onto the public. Somebody said something, somebody suggested something, and therefore it picks up momentum, and more people tend to believe it. And the problem here is that when we talk about, you know, these culture wars, more often than not, it's because you have new people showing up. That has been the history of this country, and we've talked about it over the course of this, over the course of our class. We haven't talked about it as much with immigrants from Ireland, but it happens for the Irish immigrants. But we have talked about it for Southern and Eastern Europeans, right? When Southern and Eastern Europeans showed up in the United States, they were seen as the other, right? Because their skin color was different, their religion was different, their languages were different, and their cultures were different, their foods were different, and they were taking jobs. And because they were taking American jobs, they were forced to live in very poor housing. The same thing was said for Chinese immigrants. The same thing was said for Mexican immigrants. I mean, and of course, consistently, that same thing was said for Black Americans, right? And so, in this particular situation, when we talk about the newest immigrants during this particular time, you have more and more immigrants who are once again coming from Central America. Who are usually trying to just escape economic crises, and more often than not, political crises. Political crises, by the way, that we actually set up, because we put in governments that turned out to be led by really corrupt people who messed everything up even worse than before, or people who are the refugees who are trying to escape drug wars. So you have refugees coming in from Central America, um, or you have people who are coming from other areas. You also have, at the same time, you have an increase of immigrants who are coming from Far East Asia or South Asia, who are coming from very different backgrounds, who are well educated, who are professionals, and coming here from for very different reasons, and adding on to um, the job market in very different ways, right? So that leads to a whole new type of diversity, right? Because you are going to have a new ethnic, a new racial, and a new economic diversity, because all of these people with their educational backgrounds, with their new racial backgrounds, are going to change the population quite a bit, right? They're going to change um, how people work, where people live. They're going to change the school populations quite a bit as well. So I want you to take a look at how Foner talks about that on pages 1094 and into 1095. It's also one of the things that Foner points out is it's also going to have an effect on Black America as well, because not all Black Americans are necessarily descendant of slaves, right? You are going to start to see a transition from, um, you know, how or where people come from in terms of immigration. You are going to see more people start immigrating from African countries. And we're talking from places like Nigeria, especially, but Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia. And what's interesting is that, you are going to have, really well, particularly from Nigeria and Ghana, really well educated uh, immigrants and immigrant families in particular, coming in from Nigeria and Ghana, coming in and bringing their already middle class wealth and changing the economic diversity there as well. So that's going to change things up and challenge racial perceptions in that sense as well. So when we talk about the changing face of Black America, what's interesting here is that, you know, um, for those immigrants who are from Nigeria and Ghana and Ethiopia. And then, of course, Kenya is also going to add on to that, because you are going to start to see more Kenyan families come in. They're going to experience racism in an interesting way as well. For them, they will be defined as Black, but they will be seen as, for them, they are truly African American. And so that's when you start to see the real sort of dividing line, right? And it's interesting because there is a real, true perception of what it means to be Black in America. And there is a shift in this racial and cultural identity. And people don't seem to understand that, when we talk about this growing racial diversity that's taking place, not just among Black and African Americans, but among all Americans, that there is. That there is this massive divide taking place, um, that's affecting schooling, that's affecting housing, and it's only growing, right? That leads me to this whole idea of the prison industrial complex. And the prison industrial complex is something that I want you to learn more about. I'm going to post a video about it on Canvas, and I want you to learn more about it through this video. But I want you to also make sure that you understand more about it through the reading. But the prison industrial complex is something that really develops in the relationship between cities and cities that have lost industry and are looking to gain some sort of income, right? And so what starts to happen is that cities that are looking to sort of gain some sort of industrial identity, rather than invest in educational opportunities and rather than invest in opportunities where they are investing in something that could long term add to add value, they are instead turning to create prisons. And so what happens is, beginning in the 1970s, you start to see an increase in the number of prisons being built in cities and towns across the United States. And the reason why this is a bad thing is because you have a lot of people who are essentially uh, barely getting out of high school, barely graduating high school, and then getting jobs specifically for the prisons. And that's where they get all of and they get good pay. They get their insurance through the prison. They get their pay through the prison. They get their pension through the prison. And when you talk about the identity of a city or a town through a prison, rather than through a school, rather than through a university, or through something positive, and instead it's through a prison, it does something psychologically right? It does something psychologically to that city's identity, even if it's, forget education, if it's through a factory, it does something psychologically to the identity of that place. And so I want you to read up about the prison industrial complex. I also want you to learn about it through this video that I'm going to post on Canvas. It is important for you to understand that um, the vast majority of people who are imprisoned are minorities, and that does something too. And of course, Oklahoma has the dubious distinction of imprisoning more women than anywhere else in the world, as in the planet. So there's that. Now, a shift in topics here. Um, I want to talk about something that is incredibly important and one of the great achievements of the George H.W. Bush, excuse me, George H.W. Bush administration, and that is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, one of the things that you have to remember is that prior to 1990, if you were a person with any sort of a limitation at all in terms of physical limitation or anything like that, whether it is walking with mobility with a wheelchair or anything like that, if there was no ramp available for you, then you weren't going to get into the building. There really was no other way around it. Um, and nobody felt there was a need to help. And this was the great struggle. When we talk about the fight for helping those who needed this kind of help, it was a real battle. In fact, there were some uh, who believed that this sort of legislation was a waste of money. That those who were those who needed this sort of help or support um, just simply shouldn't get this kind of help or support. They should rely on others. Now, this was really born out of something that came from the HIV/AIDS movement, right? The struggle for um, getting help for those who were struggling with the AIDS epidemic, particularly in the early 1980s. Uh, they were seen as being punished by God, and therefore they did not deserve any sort of extra help. This was the mentality. Um, they were fired from jobs. They were released from their health insurance, and therefore they could not get any kind of help. Um, and so, this idea that because you were ill or because you needed help, because you needed support, you could be released or you could be fired, you could be let go for any particular reason. Um, it was perfectly legal. There was no support for you, there was no protection for you. And it made no kind of sense, particularly at this time period. And the Americans with Disabilities Act finally comes through in 1990 and essentially says you could not discriminate in the hiring and promotion of persons with disabilities or uh, persons who have any kind of issue of that nature. Um, that leads me to this whole idea of accepting or embracing people of different backgrounds and different ideas and um, different cultures and that sort of thing. And that's multiculturalism. So multiculturalism, as he talks about on page 1102, becomes this brand new term in the 1990s of being aware of diversity, right? Being aware of um, where people come from and who people are, and their different backgrounds and different values and different cultures and different races. The thing is that multiculturalism becomes like uh, at once a buzzword and at the same time becomes a trigger word for others, right? Because some people think, oh, this is a bad thing. This means that we're losing our identity. This means that we're going to that they want us to sacrifice our American identity. But as our primary sources would remind you, in all of these challenges, these assignments where I'm asking you to identify who is an American, as they would all remind you, there really is no such thing as an American identity, right? That's the uniqueness about being an American. There is no real identifiable American identity, right? It's all multiple things all at once. That's the point. Um, so that's the whole thing about multiculturalism, is that, you know, it's accepting this whole idea of multiple um, multiple cultures and multiple um, backgrounds, right? But that sort of brings me to um, this point, right? And that is, you know, when it comes to this idea of culture wars, and he gets into this on page 1103, culture wars becomes this sort of target, right? The reason why they use the term culture wars, they will be um, cultural conservatives who believe that there is an American identity, that there is a specific person who fits what it means to be an American. Um, and we've talked about those people before, and those people are going to be nativists, right? And that means that they are going to have a specific idea of what an American looks like, what an American sounds like, what an American believes, how an American feels, what an American values. And so those people, nativists, are going to argue that culture wars exist, and those culture wars, specifically in the 1980s and the 1990s, are particularly about morality, about moral issues, right? And so when we talk about the moral issues in particular in the 1990s, it's going to be about things like gay marriage. Gay marriage becomes a huge issue in the 1990s. And here's the thing: the irony is that, you know, while gay marriages was significant, nobody was really ready to talk about gay marriage because it was still hard enough to talk about people serving as openly gay in the military, right? So that's particularly significant. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is the fact that when we talk about the Defense of Marriage Act, which Foner explains even more on page 1103, the Defense of Marriage Act, which is passed in 1996, specifically says that if you are a part of a gay couple, you could not benefit from spousal benefits. That are enlisted by federal law. That things like, let's say, if your spouse was dying, or had died, or if your partner, if your partner, if you were in a gay relationship and your partner had passed, then you, regardless of how long you were in that partnership, could not then benefit from your partner's social security, for example. Um, and even if they had listed you as the beneficiary, or if that person had been your partner for 40 years and they had retired, you could not benefit from their pension. I mean, these are the things that, if under federal law, if they were a federal employee and they were receiving their pension, you could not be the beneficiary of that pension. This is a real tragedy here. Um, but it was all under the guise of, we're trying to protect what we believe is truly American. But who's defining the culture, right? Who's defining um, this idea of family values, right? That's the thing. Like, on page 1104, he talks about this whole principle of family values, but whose family values? I mean, by the 1990s, or throughout the 1990s, family values are really sort of questionable, because by then, 50% of all marriages had reached divorce. So, whose family values? You know, I mean, people were being raised and living in all sorts of different household situations. People are living in single family homes. People are living with their children are living with their grandparents, with aunts and uncles. And some are living with their moms and dads, and some are living in foster care situations. I mean, it really sort of depends. So whose family values are defining what family values are, right? I mean, this is the question. And in the meantime, you know, that's that whole idea of, and this is going back to Newt Gingrich and the idea of the freedom revolution, and that's that sort of thinking is feeding into this wars principle, and this culture wars mentality, but it's also feeding into um, this sort of mentality of a very anti-government extreme. When we talk about the anti-government extreme, that's really sort of taken up arms. The reason why it's pushing forward is that, by the time Bill Clinton, takes over as president in 1993, there's this real message that comes out. Oh, the Democrats are going to take your guns. They're going to take um, everything you've got. And so there's this real right wing push to be protective of your guns, stock up on all the guns you want. There's never any attempt to take the guns. But it's this fear, right? And so then at the same time, there are all of these things that take place, um, such as the cult that takes over Waco, Texas, with David Koresh in 1994. And so you have all of these, and then there's a family in Ruby Ridge, and that takes place in 1993. You have these extremists that sort of feed into this mentality. David Koresh, not so much, but Ruby Ridge, yes. That helps to fan the flames of the rise in militia groups, anti-government militia groups, who believe that the government is trying to take over things. The government is trying to take our guns. The government is trying to take over our individual rights. And that's where guys like Timothy McVeigh are going to come together with other anti government extremists and put together this plan of attacking a federal building. And so I've included this clip of tracing the roots of America's biggest terror attack to that point, which is, of course, the attack on Oklahoma City at the Murrah bombing. So that leads to um, the year 2000, where um, we have a very difficult and challenging time period politically with the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And really, what this comes down to um, is yet another battle between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich. That's really what this is about. Over the course of the 8 years that Bill Clinton is in office, you have challenge after challenge after challenge from the Republicans in Congress to figure out how to uh, get rid of this guy, right? How do you remove Bill Clinton? How do you take the wind out of his sails? How do you get rid of his popularity? Because Bill Clinton really sort of stays in terms of his popularity. He stays about in the 50% range. And they don't understand why. Like, how does he get reelected? Well, you nominate a Republican like Bob Dole, who's a nice enough guy, but he's kind of older and people think he's a little old fashioned. And so they don't think he's good enough for the presidency. And so they don't understand how Bill Clinton manages to stay in office for as long as he does, and how does he stay as popular for as long as he does. They try to go after Hillary Clinton. That doesn't work either. They don't know what to do, and in the end, it's Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is the key to destroying Bill Clinton. That's really that's really what this comes down to. So Bill Clinton, of course, has an affair, as Bill Clinton tends to do, which, ironically enough, around the same time, so does Newt Gingrich. Um, talking about family values. So, he- and ironically enough, just so you know, that's the one thing that the two of them actually bond over. The two of them have a conversation about, marriage and stuff. I'm not kidding about that. That's a true story. So, yeah, he has an affair. And he has an affair while he's in the Oval Office. And that's what they get him on. That is what they decide to impeach him over, his conduct. um, and they try to, again, this is bringing up this whole idea of culture wars, and particularly family values, while he's president of the United States, which, is all sorts of irony, but all right. So, of course, impeachment doesn't work. It falls flat, and it really doesn't go as far as they want it to go. And in fact, ironically enough, Bill Clinton leaves far more popular than he was when he first came into office. I mean, when he came into office in 1993, he was a semi popular guy. And when he leaves, he's even more popular. The public is completely fascinated. They're obsessed with the story. It's disgusting and gross. And, what are you going to do? Um, and in the meantime, even with all of that popularity, it's still not the most important story of the year. The most important story of the year, of course, is the election of 2000, between former Vice President under Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and George W. Bush, who is, of course, the eldest son of George H.W. Bush. Now, interestingly enough, George W. Bush was actually not the one who was supposed to run for president. What the Bush family believed, was that it would actually be the other Bush son, Jeb Bush. But George W. Bush was the one who was recruited for the job. And he was the one recruited, many believe, because he was the one who um, people believed would be able to listen a little bit better than Jeb. Jeb Bush has a mind of his own and makes decisions uh, more like his father. and that would be a little bit problematic for the agenda that they wanted to set. And so George W. Bush comes in with the background of being governor of the state of Texas, and um, as the man who um, ran against the sitting senator of Arizona, John McCain, George W. Bush, uh, in and of himself, is not necessarily a strategically vindictive or vicious person, but the people he surrounds himself with are. So, for example, when the presidential primaries for the Republican Party reaches South Carolina, um, the odds look especially good for Senator John McCain. John McCain and his wife had adopted a daughter from South Asia. And so, of course, this is a young, dark skinned girl who, at that time, I believe, was in lower elementary school. I want to say in the first or second grade. And to stop John McCain's momentum, George W. Bush's campaign manager, Karl Rove, put together a campaign ad that basically said that John McCain had fathered a black daughter, um, and uh, had pictures of this little girl from South Asia that they had adopted, and plastered it all over South Carolina. And of course, they never claimed ownership of it, but that's how George W. Bush ended up winning the South Carolina primary. They played to very racist, um, very racist undertones, and this is the sort of um, background people that George W. Bush had, and it's not something that his parents were very thrilled about. That said, when it comes time to the election itself between Bush and Gore, it really comes down to the state of Florida. And when it comes to this particular state, what's interesting here is that, when you consider um, the 2020 election and all of these claims of a disputed election and all of this stuff, keep in mind all of these disputes that have come up. There are multiple states, and there is no challenge whatsoever. There's literally no doubt. But in this particular case, in the state of Florida, it was literally down to one state and just a few hundred votes. Literally just a few hundred votes in Florida. That's it. So it comes down to a Supreme Court decision, Bush v. Gore, which was one of the strangest Supreme Court decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. Even Foner says that. I mean, so you can read about it on pages 1106 and 1107. So it was a 5-4 decision, and basically, the decision itself is justified by the 14th Amendment. And so the whole thing is basically saying, um, so of course, in Florida, the governor of Florida just happened to be George Bush's brother, Jeb. Um, so uh, Jeb Bush certified that his brother had indeed won the state. So by the time it gets to the Supreme Court basically says, okay, all of the ballots in the state are counted according to a single standard. Um, but how do you do that? Because within the state itself, there is no one single way of voting. Every county had a different type of ballot. So it was impossible to apply that particular clause to this particular situation. It made no sense whatsoever. Um, and I don't know. It was the most bizarre situation. And to live through it, it was insane. It was all sorts of insanity. So it leads to this whole question about the state of the democracy, right? Because now you have this whole question about the state of our democracy in general, right? Because even Bob Dole, who had lost the presidential uh, election in 1996, had come back to say, "Listen, I told you guys about the Electoral College. I think the Electoral College is messed up, and we need to revisit this issue." And so people even then were starting to talk about the Electoral College, starting to talk about the validity of having different types of ballots across the states. Like, what are we doing here? And why haven't we modernized our types of elections? Like, why haven't we changed how we approach voting? And in true American fashion, we have yet to fix it. It's been 21 years and we have yet to fix it. Um, although, shout out to Florida. Florida did fix their problems. So, shout out to Florida. That's the one and only time that I will give a shout out to Florida. Let me just say that. That's the one and only time that I will give a shout out to Florida. They fixed their issues, but the rest of the country has not. And so, as you've seen, you have all of these different issues where people get the chance to be able to say, but what about this? But what about this? There is the fact that we still have to vote on a Tuesday. It makes absolutely no sense. Why is voting on a Tuesday? The fact that Tuesdays are voting days was set up because that was the day that farmers went to town to bring in their crops. I didn't realize that we were still living in the 18th century. Uh, so, like, why isn't voting day a day off? Or why is voting day just one day? Um, why are people having to wait in line for literally hours? I mean, these are the questions that we should be asking, and why these are the things that we should be dealing with, especially considering that we like to present ourselves, and we have presented ourselves as the face of democracy. I mean, that's something worth considering. Okay, so literally within the first year of his term, George W. Bush is confronted with the most um, significant uh, terrorist attack in the history of the United States. Right? It's the biggest attack um, that has happened in the country's history. And what will happen is that this attack will be the one paradigm shifting moment in terms of uh, challenging our country's approach to who we are in the 21st century. This will be the moment, right? It hadn't happened before. It had not happened since the collapse of communism. This will be the moment. This will be the moment that suggests um, that we define ourselves finally for the 21st century. And of course, that's September 11th. Um, so, September 11th, as you will read on page 1108, is of course the attack on the World Trade Center, as well as the attack on the Pentagon and the attempted attack on, or the what was supposed to be the attack on the White House, but ended up crashing, a plane crash in Pennsylvania. Um, so you'll read about that, and of course you'll watch um, this clip, but in doing so, one of the things that um, I want you to understand is this thing is not launched by a country, it is launched by an individual, right? So, for the first time in history, we are not fighting we're not fighting an individual country. We're not fighting against the Soviet Union. We are not fighting even against communism. Um, so keep that in mind. People are feeling and thinking about life in general, right? Um, we now have this brand new term, and that is we are at war. And we're not just, again, we're not at war with another country. We're not even at war with an ideology. We're at war on terrorism. And so, what does that mean? And that's the thing. We don't really know what that means. Um, so, President Bush gives this speech where he talks about um, he gives a speech on September 20th, so just a little over a week after the attacks, gives a speech to a joint session of Congress where he is picking up on, um, as Foner points out, sort of picking up on what Franklin Roosevelt does, and that is addressing the nation with these tones of what a president would say after you've been attacked, right? And essentially trying to explain what has happened to the United States. And what he talks about is, as Foner quotes, he says, on page 1109, freedom and fear are at war. The advance of human freedom now depends on us. And that's who we have become in 2001. We are now the nation who are supposed to be the nation that promotes this idea of human freedom, right? Which sounds familiar, but how we're going to do that is very different than what his predecessors, excuse me, what his predecessors have done, right? Because no one before him has done it like this. What he is going to do is he is going to start talking about um, the fact that you are now dealing with individuals who have been pushing these ideals of evil, right? And this speech in particular is what is going to launch his what is now called the Bush Doctrine. This particular speech that he gives is officially launching this war on terrorism. And basically, what he's doing is he is targeting um, an enemy that you cannot define. And that's the kicker. See, even communism, you could define it. You can define communism in the Soviet Union. You could define communism in North Korea. You could define communism in China. You can find communism wherever it was popping up. You could even define communism through the Red Scare. But terrorism was a little bit more difficult because where was terrorism? Who was a terrorist? What did terrorism look like? We didn't know. Terrorism wasn't necessarily a specific ideology. You just didn't know how terrorism was really defined. It was so vague and it was it had no real boundaries, right? And this is the problem. And there was no, as Foner points out, there's no middle ground here. As Bush says very clearly, either you're with us or you're against us, and there's no other way around it. And so this sort of thinking and this sort of principle is really difficult to follow too, because that sort of thinking meant, okay, well, either we support you, or either you support us or you're against us. But wait a second, then that meant that either they're an ally or they're an enemy. That's really problematic. Um, that meant then that he was now identifying anyone who did not support his decisions as an enemy. And that could be really, really problematic, right? Because that's what helps pushes him and his foreign policy towards a war in Afghanistan. So the war in Afghanistan um, is justified by uh, fighting the Taliban. So the Taliban had long been identified as an extreme Muslim extremist organization, and it had been believed that this is something that had been sponsored by Bin Laden, by Osama bin Laden, who, by the way, Osama bin Laden had been one time sponsored by, supported by none other than the United States. Because Osama bin Laden had one time, living in Afghanistan, fought against the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union had occupied Afghanistan in the 1980s, and the Afghanis were fighting for their independence, trying to get rid of Soviet occupation. And we sent him money, we sent him weapons, and bin Laden gave the money, kept the money, gave weapons to his supporters. They fought off the Soviets, and for a little bit of time there, Osama bin Laden was a friend. And then, well, there's that. So Osama bin Laden was believed to be in Afghanistan and believed to be supportive of the Taliban, which is absolutely true, because the Taliban had been and is still an extremist organization, right? So we launched this war in Afghanistan, but George W. Bush takes it a step further. And in the speech that he gives to Congress, in this joint speech, he had identified what he called the axis of evil. And in this axis of evil, he identifies three countries that had been sponsors, he claims, sponsors of um, terrorists, and had been developing, uh, again, he claims, developing weapons of mass destruction. These countries were Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Okay. So these three countries were developing these weapons, as Foner describes. These weapons of mass destruction are nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. All of them were potentially threats to specifically the United States, because all three of these countries hated the United States. They hated freedom, which, of course, is what we represent, right? So that's how I'm going to keep this from playing. I'll post this on Canvas. But that's how he pursues Iraq in the Second Gulf War. He uses this argument for the axis of evil and says, we are um, going after this enemy that has these weapons of mass destruction. And we know that they do. There is no evidence to support this claim that they have weapons of mass destruction. And yet, and still, what ends up happening is we go into Iraq for the second time. And in confronting Iraq for the second time, what ends up happening is you have essentially a second Bush administration that is uh, essentially run by people from the first Bush administration, except these people carry more influence this time than they did the first time. But I want to identify two people in particular um, who are worth mentioning uh, more so now than they were the last time. So that would be now Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. So Dick Cheney had served under George H.W. Bush, as had Donald Rumsfeld. So Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense, and Donald Rumsfeld had also served under George H.W. Bush. The two of them were insistent that Saddam Hussein, be removed from power. In fact, when the first Bush, George H.W. Bush, was in power, they had argued and argued and argued that George H.W. Bush used the opportunity to remove Hussein from power. Uh, and the first Bush absolutely refused and said no, because it would end up being another Vietnam War, and for what? Uh, so they tried it again with George W. Bush, this time with a little bit more influence, and they insisted they also believed that the people of Iraq would be incredibly grateful, that they would welcome. In fact, this is the message that was sold to the American people, that the Americans would be welcomed as heroes. And Colin Powell, who had served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under George H.W. Bush, was now serving as Secretary of State under George W. Bush. Colin Powell had gone to the United Nations and said, we definitely have proof that there was weapons of mass destruction there in Iraq. Colin Powell would later say that he regretted actually making that statement. Colin Powell was not entirely convinced of this story. He was not entirely convinced that this was the way to go. Just like he had supported the first senior Bush's decision not to remove Saddam Hussein, he was not entirely convinced that this was the right decision, primarily because he again was someone who had said that the reason why Vietnam did not work was because there was no strategy on how to get out, and no real goal. Nobody had a goal, right? But this is what happens with the Iraq War. When we talk about um, the whole idea of what happens in Iraq, a couple of months into the Iraq War, uh, even though there's no link between the Iraq War and 9/11, there's no evidence to indicate that there are weapons of mass destruction. The United States goes forward with a war, and there is suddenly an announcement of a regime change. There's a push to remove Hussein from power. And when all hell breaks loose, uh, what ends up happening is you have this massive anti war movement. Uh, for example, France ends up uh, speaking out against the war, and um, the United States, many Americans get very angry about France speaking out against us, and we decided that we aren't going to stand by while France criticizes us. And then you have this moment where George W. Bush flies onto the deck of an aircraft carrier with this banner hanging behind him that says "Mission Accomplished," and we end up fighting in a war that lasts not a couple of months like the banner suggests, but several years, that and it only recently ended. I mean, this is the thing. And the problem with that is that when we talk about this particular situation, it did end up, and not only did it end up being another Vietnam, it was longer than the Vietnam War. It was our longest lasting war. And if you guys look at the situation that has been left behind, um, not just in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan, both of these countries have been left in an absolute quagmire, right? Because both of these countries have been left in complete chaos and instability. The Taliban has taken over again in Afghanistan, and Iraq has been left to total instability as well in terms of their control, just as George H.W. Bush had predicted. Um, and let me just add this: when we talk about the aftermath of September 11th at home, the impact of 9/11 at home, you know, this particular administration is is really interesting because what they try to do in terms of using 9/11 and using 9/11 as justification to expand the power of the president, expand the power of the federal government, and in a different way than say somebody like Franklin Roosevelt. Um, Here's one of the things that you should know. So the war on terrorism, as Fonar points out on page 1114, the war on terrorism and the 9/11 attacks helps to justify the passage of what's called the Patriot Act, right? And so the Patriot Act basically says, um, first of all, let me just emphasize, no one actually reads the Patriot Act. They just hear about it and they say, it's a time of emergency, we need to pass it. So the Patriot Act basically says, um, whatever we've got to do to protect ourselves, we've got to do it. And that essentially means, um, the government has the power to spy on citizens, open your letters, listen to your phone calls, read your email, look at your personal records, um, whatever it's got to do in the name of protecting ourselves from domestic terrorism. So if they don't like what you have been doing in the name of domestic terrorism, they can justify spying on you, right? And the thing is they really vaguely defined what domestic terrorism was, and they do that on purpose so that they can spy on you. That's the problem with the Patriot Act, right? That's really problematic, particularly when you consider that it's a big time violation of individual rights and civil liberties, right? It's exactly what someone like Dwight Eisenhower would be warning against. um, in his speech, in his farewell address, this is exactly what he says. um, you've got to be careful of, right? He says, don't let fear allow you to give up your civil liberties. This is exactly what he's talking about, right? So, 2 months after the Patriot Act was passed, suddenly the Bush administration was holding these, secret tribunals, secret military tribunals for non citizens in the name of national security, and then they were held in Guantanamo Bay for months, sometimes years at a time, without access to a lawyer, without access to any kind of representation. And that's not who we are. And so you have to ask yourself, well, wait a second, that's not the American way of doing things. And so if we're not doing things like that, then how does that make us better than the people that we're fighting against, right? Or the principles that we are fighting against, or the ideologies that we are fighting against, right? That leads me to this question of the power of the president, because one of the things that starts to come up here is that you have this huge expansion of the power of the executive in this really uh, sort of troubling way, um, in the sense that you have it's almost like McCarthyism come to the presidency, and it's all done in this justification of fear, right? Like, and remember, in the wake of 9/11, everybody's panicked, guys. I don't know how else to emphasize this. Everybody is scared, and we don't know um, if something else is going to happen. We don't know if another big attack is coming, and they have these ratings on the screen every day. If there's a threat level and what the threat level is going to be, and and looking back now, we can say that they were definitely taking advantage of our fear, right? But that's 20 years, right? That's 20 years ago. But at that time, the panic was palpable. And that's the problem, is that when the panic is palpable, there's a lot that they can accomplish and do. And in the meantime, one of the things that they start to um, realize, one of the things that Americans start to realize is that our behavior starts to get out of control in a lot of ways. Like, for example, Foner talks about the torture controversy, which you should read about on page 1115. It's really problematic because um, the behavior that we start to witness from our own men and women in uniform is very troubling. And this is taking place in Iraq. It is very troubling. And um, it's not something that we would typically allow or support. And so it's something that we start to demand a change for. And when we witness that, that's when you start to see Americans start paying attention to what's happening in a larger sense, right? Um, as you as a few years go by, and the war continues to go on, and these sorts of behaviors continue to go on, um, it's another thing that takes place is that Americans start to pay attention to the fact that, wait a second, these are things that people are um, not going to, that these are things that are happening that shouldn't be allowed to happen. So, for example, there's a court case that appears before the Supreme Court called Hamdi versus Rumsfeld. On page 1116, Foner talks about this in more detailed, but Hamdi was someone who had appeared, who he was an American citizen who had moved to Saudi Arabia, and had happened to be captured. And so he's an American citizen, I want to emphasize. So he's arrested and taken to jail. And while he's in jail, he's taken to jail in South Carolina, never uh, been pressed with charges, but he's also never been allowed to see a lawyer. So no charges, no lawyer, nothing. An American citizen, let me just add, an American citizen who was never allowed to see a lawyer and never been pressed with charges. So he ends up um, finally filing a lawsuit. The Supreme Court ends up hearing the case and ruled that he had the right, as an American citizen, to a judicial hearing. And he said, and this is the um, really most important statement that comes out of this hearing. And this is from Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. uh, in an 8-1 majority. The 8-1 majority says a state of war is not a blank check for the president when it comes to the rights of the nation's citizens. And that's really the key, right? Just because we're at war, whether it's a war with another country or the war on terrorism, doesn't mean that you, as president of the United States, or you working for the president, get to do whatever it is that you feel like you can do. You don't get to abuse your power. And that's the key, right? The American people really figured out that there had been this um, shift, right, in the kind of power and control that the executive had been uh, using during this time period in the name of national security, and the Supreme Court had been essentially putting on some limits there. And so one of the things that the Supreme Court essentially is trying to do, um, and this is what Anthony Kennedy writes in one other decision that I want to mention, and this happens in 2008. So this was a specifically a decision in regards to detainees in Guantanamo Bay. He wrote, this is on page again 1116. The laws and Constitution are designed to survive and remain in force in extraordinary times. And that's really everything. That even in the most difficult, the most challenging times, when all hell is breaking loose and it's chaos and there's fear and panic everywhere, that the one thing that you can count on is that the laws and Constitution of the United States are still there. They are still standing and they are still there and they are still true.